First, I want to thank EMET for holding this terrific event. I want to thank Sarah personally for inviting me to speak. It means a lot to me. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to educate yourselves on this important topic. And I do hope you'll consider supporting the work of EMET. I know Sarah and her staff work tirelessly to convey an unadulterated pro-Israel and pro-freedom message. So the topic for today is the Istanbul process. And as you might have gathered by now, what that means is making Resolution 1618 a reality, despite the fact that there's nothing in the resolution that mandates this, and it's contrary to the norm of keeping UN resolutions in the realm of the hypothetical. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, what's at issue is the implementation of the concept of defamation of religions. And what that means is giving an idea or a religion, in this case Islam, protection from criticism, as opposed to what we have in the American legal system, which is defamation protections of an individual or group of individuals. So we have defamation of an idea or a religion versus defamation of people. In the American legal system, in addition to what I just said, for something to be defamatory, it has to be a false statement of fact. Truth is a defense. For example, if I say something bad about someone, no matter how terrible it is, if it's true or mere opinion, it's not defamatory. By stark contrast, the OIC's definition of defamation means anything that sheds a negative light on Islam or Muslims, even if it's true and even if it's opinion. Taking that a step further, it also includes anything that would violate Islamic blasphemy codes. For example, in Islam, it's prohibited to draw depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. If you do that, even if you show him in a positive light, that's blasphemy, and the OIC would consider it defamation as well. So, who's pushing this idea of combating defamation of Islam? A lot of Islamist organizations are doing it, but here we're talking about the OIC. And let's be clear about the nature of who the OIC is. It is an Islamist supremacist organization whose long-term vision is the worldwide implementation of Sharia law. Its top priorities are the supremacy of Islam and what's in the best interest of the Islamic Ummah. It's within this framework, through the lens of Sharia law, that all concepts set forth by the OIC must be examined. Their ultimate goal is the international criminalization of all speech that's critical of Islam, Muslims, Islamic theocracies, Sharia law, and even Islamic terrorism. The OIC uses primarily legal instruments in order to achieve its goals, such as UN resolutions and EU parliamentary legislation, often in a watered-down form, in order to accomplish its mission gradually and incrementally. And though the resolution is called defamation of religions, it applies to Islam only in its implementation and the OIC's interpretation, and there's absolutely no reciprocity for anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, or anti-Israel hate speech. At a certain point, the U.S. realized that the concept of defamation of religions had potentially dire consequences for freedom of speech. So after 11 years of passage of this resolution in the UN, the U.S. asked the OIC to draft an alternative resolution that would both retain freedom of expression and still address the OIC's concerns about alleged Islamophobia. Resolution 1618 to combat intolerance based on religion or belief was the result. And although the U.S. and various Christian organizations fully supported it because they believed that it moved from protecting an idea or a religion to protecting persecuted minorities and specifically from discrimination or violence. So the text of the resolution 1618 does drop the defamation of religions language and, as Anne said, focuses on intolerance, discrimination, and incitement to violence. But the language is still open to interpretation. There are numerous problems with it. I only have time to go over 2 of them with you today. So the first clause I'm going to draw to your attention, and please pay attention to my language, is it condemns, quote, the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, and asks states to take effective action against it. Okay, so what's wrong with this clause? First of all, it comes frighteningly close to outlawing hatred, which you might have noticed is an emotion. And there's also ample reason to believe that criticism of Islam, in other words, defamation of religions, will constitute the advocacy of hatred that amounts to the incitement that's condemned. The second clause I want to draw to your attention is that it calls for the criminalization of imminent incitement to violence. Well, what's wrong with that? America already has laws that prohibit the imminent incitement to violence. But what's the definition of incitement? America uses a content-based test, and the OIC wants to use a consequence-based test. So in America, if I say, I hate Joe, and I want you all to get together tomorrow at 2 o'clock and kill him, and then you go do that, then you'll be responsible for murder, and I'll be responsible for my comments because the content of my language encouraged the violence. That's a content-based test. The OIC wants to use a consequence-based test, and the example most frequently used is that of the Danish cartoons. So if you remember, as was already alluded to, in 2006, there was a series of cartoons on the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Subsequently, riots ensued all across Europe, all across the Middle East. The Danish embassies were trashed, people were killed, and mayhem ensued. The OIC would say that those riots were the consequence of the cartoon. So there are numerous problems with this definition, as you can see. First of all, it's a retroactive definition. Your words don't become criminal until someone later decides to respond to them in a violent manner. Second of all, I don't remember where it was. Second of all, it's in complete contradiction to the Judeo-Christian notions of personal responsibility. It shifts the responsibility for the violent act from the violent actor to the person who made a comment, a cartoon, a film, who might passively be offensive. And third, and this is really the most important thing, what it does is, in effect, it enforces the concept of defamation of Islam, the very concept that Resolution 1618 was purportedly designed to defeat. I also want to mention that according to the OIC, anybody who, quote, defames Islam is an Islamophobe. So you can see from their overly broad definition of defamation that they have a very different definition of Islamophobia as well, and it encompasses much more than the American notion of mere bigotry. So in Resolution 1618, when you're trying to combat intolerance, and what could be more intolerant than being Islamophobic, which some people are equating with racism, sexism, and the like, you're not just protecting Muslims, but you're protecting Islam as well. This resolution did replace the defamation of religion's language and replaced it with the European hate speech style language, but the OIC has made it very clear that it has retained its goal to combat defamation of Islam. In July of 2011, Hillary Clinton attended a high-level diplomatic meeting in Istanbul, Turkey on Islamophobia. At that meeting, she announced to the world that the State Department would host a conference on the Istanbul process to make Resolution 1618 a reality. So it's called the Istanbul Conference, since the first meeting was in Istanbul, and the State Department did later host such a meeting. Holding this conference legitimized the OIC's positions, it played into their claims of victimhood, and it signaled to the rest of the free world that partnering with the OIC is not only acceptable, but perhaps even desirable. And though the EU had previously kept the OIC at arm's length, following America's lead, the EU will be hosting the third Istanbul Conference later this month. So the Istanbul Conference was a 3-day meeting held in December 2011, held primarily behind closed doors. Approximately 30 countries and international organizations attended, including the OIC and the EU. The OIC made it very clear that its goal for the conference was to push for speech restrictive measures on Islam-related topics. And if the State Department really did have a concern at the time of the drafting of the resolution to retain free speech, and I believe it did, then somehow by the time the conference came around, its entire focus moved to protecting religious minorities, more specifically to protecting Muslims in the West, who are obviously fairly free and equal, rather than protecting non-Muslims in the OIC countries who are truly persecuted. And while Hillary Clinton chose not to push for the enactment of speech restrictive laws, at least for this round, and she mouthed the words of praise of free speech to the audience, she also followed it up by quickly saying that the U.S., quote, advocates for other measures to achieve the same result. Those other measures included interfaith dialogue and the use of, quote, good old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming. Hillary Clinton seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the principles underlying the First Amendment. The First Amendment was designed to encourage robust political debate and to flesh out minority viewpoints. It wasn't intended for some people to use their free speech rights to tell other people to shut up, because that's a more effective way of silencing them than using speech restrictive laws. I assume that most of you in this audience support the notion of free speech. But even if you don't, I ask you, is it the proper role of the State Department to use peer pressure and shaming to silence the speech of Americans with whom it disagrees? I think not. Secretary Clinton says that she wants to, quote, bridge the divide that separates different faiths and different cultures. The problem is the bridge of tolerance flows in only one direction, toward the Islamization of the West and the shrinking of free expression. I want to give you a few examples of how the concept of defamation of religions plays out in real life. I want to be clear, these examples are not necessarily the direct result of the OIC itself or its resolutions. As I said, there are numerous organizations pushing for these concepts, but it's just how, put into practice, it's playing out. The defamation of religions is having a chilling effect on speech and authorship in all quarters of life, from the workplace to the public sphere. Books aren't getting published, films are getting altered, TV productions are getting canceled because people are afraid of lawsuits. You can no longer talk about Islamic terrorism, Islamic human rights violations, or Islamic persecution of religious minorities without being slapped with the label Islamophobe. Corporations are changing their products, their package designs, and even their production processes in order not to defame Islam and to ensure that they address uniquely the so-called Islamic issues. And in some cases, due to fear of lawsuits, employers are giving special preferences to Muslims that they don't give to anybody else, basically exempting Muslims from the rules under which the rest of us have to live. If you're interested in this, go Google what's going on in Minnesota with EEOC claims. The FBI, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and the National Counterterrorism Center have all rewritten their training material to completely delete any mention of Islamic terrorism. Hey folks, there's no such thing as Islamic terrorism anymore. And the Department of Homeland Security took it a step further and made a concerted effort to tell their national security professionals to focus on terrorist behavior and, quote, de-link it from the underlying ideology that motivates it. In other words, the United States government, using your taxpayer dollars, is working hard to protect Islam from defamation at the expense of protecting you. And finally, just to show you how far the government's position has gone on freedom of speech, years ago, there was another document in the UN called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that has language which the Resolution 1618 mirrors. Part of Resolution 1618 almost identically mirrors one of the clauses, the advocacy to religious hatred clause, that one, that says advocacy of religious hatred. Well, in 1992, the U.S. signed a reservation, effectively opting out of that clause, insisting that Americans retain their constitutional right to express freedom of opinion. Yet now we have the U.S. State Department spearheading the efforts to implement the exact same language that the U.S. previously disavowed. And in fact, this November, the U.S. sent a representative to yet another OIC symposium held in Saudi Arabia on combating defamation of Islam. So, what we should be doing, instead of working with the OIC to restrict freedom of speech, America should be leading the charge to establish freedom of speech worldwide, equivalent to that of the United States Constitution's First Amendment. We should be condemning the human rights violations of OIC members to whom we're currently capitulating, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I can't stress this enough. We have to keep in mind that free speech constitutes a human right. Its restriction in the form of combating defamation of religions does not. It's a totally concocted idea that stands in direct opposition to real human rights. Only people should be afforded human rights. Ideas, policies, and religions ought not get protection from criticism. And finally, I want to mention that the constitutional concept of freedom of religion bears absolutely no resemblance whatever to the OIC's concept of combating defamation of religion. Religious freedom is an individual right. It is the right of an individual to freely practice his faith. It is not the right of a religion to be free from criticism. Resolutions like the ones I've discussed with you today harm free speech rights, they harm human rights, they harm religious freedom rights, they harm national security, and they harm terrorism prevention efforts. Yet, the OIC uses cries of Islamophobia to claim victimhood and gain support for its anti-freedom measures. The OIC repeatedly asserts that Islamophobia is one of the greatest threats to world peace and global security, rather than concluding that perhaps Islamophobia is the result of the actions taken by a radical Islamist movement around the globe. In conclusion, I want to say that we cannot allow the OIC to take the shield of religious freedom and turn it into a sword of state censorship. America is the last bastion of freedom and the hope of all men living under tyranny and oppression. We should be holding ourselves up as a role model for freedom, equality, and human rights, rather than exalting the Islamist enemies of freedom that constitute the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.